Hello, this is Phil Parker, and right now what we're going to talk about is kind of a couple of broad classes of algorithms we use in the step of data reduction, typically the second step in this data grubbing phase. I've got tons of data, and I want to just boil it down to something that I can actually use or interpret. Now, in the world of business and strategy, we typically talk about product spatial competition or perceptual mapping. Again, data reduction results in maps. So let's go through a little bit of history first, and then we'll get into the techniques. Starting around the year 1900, I mean, as old as business is almost in the modern era, to about the 1980s, what most organizations did when they were trying to compare, for example, competing products, is they do what's called benchmarking. You would send your products over to a laboratory. They would reverse engineer it, take it apart, and then document every single thing that might be different across different competing products. Very tangible things written on paper, and that worked pretty well. It's still a fantastic technique to understand what your competitors' products are all about. Then, towards the 1980s, it showed up in consulting firms around the world where we started talking about the relative value proposition. You see, all of those technical dimensions in benchmarking, can we boil it down to an index? Often it was an average across different key technical dimensions. Think of computers like CPU, hard disk, RAM, etc. Just having an index of high to low, boiling it down to an index, that's a data reduction, and let's call that quality. And on another dimension, we'd have price, for example. We'd draw a 45-degree angle line. Anybody below the 45-degree angle line was considered to be at a competitive disadvantage. People above the 45-degree angle line, they're at a competitive advantage. Sell your stock on the ones below the line, buy stocks above the line. Now, that was a very interesting way of looking at relative competition. Competition is very complex, and we boiled it down to two dimensions. Problem is, maybe those aren't the right dimensions. Maybe you'll find out that people below the 45-degree angle line have high market share. Well, why is that? Because maybe what competition is all about is not necessarily tangible qualities and price. This was the dawn of what was perceptual mapping. Now, many people pioneered this area, mostly coming out of the Wharton School and MIT and elsewhere, and they started using factor analysis and principal components analysis and the like to really understand the way consumers thought, right? By using elaborate questionnaires and systems we'll talk about in a minute to come up with maps. One of the earliest maps I ever saw presented in this subject area, now this is the early 1980s, was the automobile market. What's the difference between automobiles? Technically, automobiles have hundreds and hundreds of dimensions. I mean, seat size, springiness, you could go on forever. But on what basis do people really make choices? And one of the earliest maps that came out of this in the field of automotive engineering and the like was two dimensions, sporty versus luxury. And it was very easy to plot the different competitors in this space. Cadillac, for example, very luxurious, not very sporty. It's like driving a sofa around. And then Jaguar, kind of sporty. Back in those days, we had MG and Triumph over there that were very sporty but not very luxurious. And you had your mainstream automobile manufacturers, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, down in the non-luxury, non-sporty era. On top of that, we would impose something called the ideal point. Think of that as the density of demand. Ideal doesn't mean your fantasy car. It means the car that you're most likely to buy on your next purchase occasion. So there's a few people that liked Cadillac and a few people like Jaguar. So on this map, we noticed there were clusters of customers that were near the clusters of competitors, and there was a lot of satisfied customers in this space. People going for the MG and Triumph were the young students or people that wanted a little bit of sportster kind of look, but didn't have a big income perhaps. Okay, now, starting in the 1920s and 30s, there was this expression that you could buy any colored Ford as long as it was painted black. And General Motors came around and said, there's a little bit of difference there. Maybe as you increase your income, you aspire to more, you deserve better. Maybe you need to increase on the luxury dimension. Maybe you upgrade from a Chevrolet to a Buick, and from a Buick to an Oldsmobile. And finally, when you're a bank president, you can buy a Cadillac and you're buried in it, when you pass on. So that is the way the automobile industry looked at the world. Now, there's this big gap in the middle of the map there. You'll notice this big gap. During the oil shocks, many people picked up their hoteling beach blankets, right? They got up from the beach and walked over to some brands that were imports, largely Volkswagen, Toyota, Opel, Honda, etc. Those brands were developed for Japan and Germany, which don't have natural oil reserves, so they import all of their fuel. They have very high gasoline prices, so their automobiles were already very fuel efficient. To be fuel efficient, they did not have a lot of gadgets in them. They didn't have electric windows. They didn't have electric seating. They didn't have all these fancy gadgets. Therefore, they tended to break down less. They didn't have as many moving parts. They got a reputation for reliability, and that's wonderful. They were very reliable. They would go for many, many miles without breaking down. Perfect kind of automobile to buy in an economic crisis. But when there was the return of the economy, people went back to their old habits and bought bigger cars. Toyota, in a very bold move, and Honda and Nissan as well at the same time, decided to occupy that gap space. Maybe people don't want to migrate across luxury as the old automobile industry had presumed. Maybe they want to go up towards Jaguar. So you end up getting brands like Lexus Infiniti and Acura being launched. Then you notice that BMW copies and they start launching products. Mercedes-Benz, which had this four-door big sedan with a big steering wheel and the tuba player in the back, they start launching brands. Brands are going all over this map now. A lot of competition. Margins are going down. Suzuki invents a third dimension. You might call that a blue ocean, a completely new dimension, ruggedness, how well the car can drive off the road. So these maps are dynamic, and eventually you get that axis going way out, almost a armor-plated, luxury, sporty vehicle driven by insecure Californians and the former governor from Austria, the Hummer. So what are perceptual maps? Perceptual maps are photographs in time of how humans perceive the world. It's literally trying to measure human data reduction strategies. Okay, so what do we use these perceptual maps for? We use them for strategic planning purposes, especially for segmentation and positioning studies. The big difference between this and earlier technology is it doesn't stress tangibles. Rather, it stresses the psychological or non-tangible aspects of a product. That's called benchmarking when we do that. So the objective is to identify on what basis people are competing. What are those dimensions? We also want to try to find out where are the brands or the competitors in that space, and maybe the density of customer ideals. The insights we get in strategic planning from this methodology is quite simple. We find out gaps in the market where there might be a big gap. We also discover cannibalization. A lot of companies will launch new products into a map only to find out that the product will land next to an existing product they already have. One of my favorite brands way back when was called the Citroën SM. It was launched with the purpose of moving Citroën, a French brand name, towards Jaguar. Now, Citroën, like an ice cream stand, its brand positioning was poured in concrete. Now, it created this SM, a really cool car. You could look it up on Wikipedia or Google. It's amazing, this thing. It has a cool headlight beam structure in the front. When you turned your key, the suspension kind of lifted. When you stopped, you landed. The M stood for Maserati. They stuck a Maserati engine in a Citroën. The thing hauled. Unfortunately, it basically cannibalized its XM and other kinds of cars that Citroën had. So it really didn't reposition the brand into that luxury space they were wanting. Finally, if you discover that you're in a cluster of competitors, you discover that you are cannibalizing each other in the market, this does indicate some opportunity for differentiation. And this is where the 4 P's of marketing come in. What are the 4 P's of marketing? Again, the 4 P's are you need to have a product, you need to price that product, you need to promote that product, and you need to place or distribute that product. This is where marketing gets a very sleazy reputation, because now that we're dealing with customer psychology, do we need to deliver high quality or simply the perception of high quality? And there's a lot of unethical marketers out there that will mask their true qualities based on consumer signals or cues. We as human beings, we don't have time to do elaborate studies on products. So we use signals or cues to judge quality. How many of you would trust a consultant who wears white socks? It's not the right color. So you end up seeing consultants wearing what? Dark blue or black socks, because that's the right signal. So marketers, knowing they're competing on psychological dimensions, will make sure that they don't do badly on these cues and signals. Now, many consumer behavior, consumer psychologists have studied this area. It's massive. If you want, look at the Journal of Consumer Research. It has tons of examples of how consumer psychology interacts with product design, marketing, etc. Let me list a few that the literature has noted. They're quite interesting in terms of thinking about the cues that we as humans use, given that we're using data reduction. The first one is made in labels. Imagine you have a garment and it says made in Tunisia versus made in Italy. An MBA made in INSEAD or made at Bob's Business School. Made in labels are often an irrelevant cue or signal of quality. It might be that the quality is much better on one brand, just that nobody associates that quality with the brand name. I had a participant once, a German participant, who explained that for BMW at least, there was this dimension in the German mind that is not like the American mind in the automobile industry. Basically, the Germans have two beaches. One is sportiness, but the other one is engineeringness. Now, imagine I'm a brand like Citroën, and I go down to the engineering department and say, hey, give me some more engineering, guys. Just give me more engineering. They're going to say, we engineered all last night. What do you mean engineering? There is no such thing as engineering. What do you want, a fifth tire? What's engineering? Well, if you dig deep enough in the German mind, do some focus groups, here's what you discover. The Germans have this perception that if a car is well engineered, you should be able to drive it for 200,000 kilometers at 200 kilometers an hour. And the engine will not wear out. The only problem is you can't make that judgment call before you buy the car. Now, about 17% of Germans read comparative statistics across different manufacturers where someone has done such tests. But what do the other 83% of Germans do? Well, they close the door. Thunk. Good engine. In other words, door rubbers are a signal of engine durability. Now, I had a German participant in one of my classes say, "Nein, this is not true." Well, research it on the internet. You'll find out that the German automobile industry invented this sound engineering concept because one sound can infer a quality on another part of the car that's irrelevant. So Stuttgart has laboratories that test all types of door rubbers, etc., so that they simulate what it's like to be in a car for 200,000 kilometers and making sure that the, quote, sounds are correct after that 200,000 usage. Therefore, the car has not worn out. Versus a Peugeot, clink, maybe a strange sound would infer that the engine is not well engineered, when in fact the engine might be perfect. So, irrelevant signals and cues are used all the time. Nobody respects your profession. Just create a PhD in it, a PhD in marketing, for example. Parker came up with this study where if you click a pen a certain way, people infer how much ink is being used in the pen itself. Does it have a lot of ink or little ink? The sound and the feel of the click of a pen is inference for how long it'll write for. Very few people, robotically will test how long a pen will write for. We just don't do that kind of test. We make an inference based on these signals of quality. You ask French people, hey, would you ever use or buy or purchase an American cheese? And they say, oh, no, jamais, never would we ever buy an American cheese, never. Unless maybe if it was on a hamburger, but even then, we'd prefer a French cheese. And I go, oh, that's interesting. Can you tell me about the French cream cheese market? We have all these types of cheeses, Boursin, Rondelet, etc. And they go, yeah, we've heard of those. Okay, where do those cheeses come from? Where does Rondelet come from, for example? What's the origin of that? Now, most French people pride themselves on knowing the origin, the geographic origin of cheeses. And they'll think about it and go, those are cream cheeses, so they're not really cheeses, kind of. C'est pas du fromage, ça. They kind of like think about it a little bit. And then they'll say, Normandy, Brittany, probably. Rondelet, that got to the second position in market share there. You can find it in the Air France lounge once in a while. actually comes from La Jolla, California. It was a bunch of people in Southern California who came up with this idea of mixing spices with cream cheese and selling it. They entered in the Belgian market first and then proceeded to go into France. So rondelet, R-O-N-D, ronde, round, kind of like a cheese. So how you name a product. Teflon watches was perceived to be of high quality, even though there are no Teflon watches. Price can be a signal of quality. How so? How many of the women of the world would like to receive as a gift Chanel No. 5 if it was €5 a liter? That's too low. That's too low. Imagine you go to a hotel. It's in a rural area in Europe, very rural, and they're quoting you €480 a night. Tell me about the bathroom. What is that bathroom like? Well, you might imagine very nice floor, tile floors, maybe marble, fluffy towels, two bathrobes, very fluffy. I haven't even told you the brand name. I haven't even shown you a picture. I've only told you the price. And you invented in your mind what that hotel is. Now, you go to the same phone number, dial them up, and they quote you a different price. A clever MBA might say, well, the hotel's not used a lot of the time, so why don't we change our tariffing to €20 an hour? For 24 hours, that's €480. It's the same price. You call a hotel and say, hey, what's your price? And they say, oh, we're €20 an hour. Now tell me about the bathroom. What are the towels like in that bathroom? The real question is, how would you actually know unless you've been there? This price signaling quality tells you that the demand curve isn't downward sloping. The relationship between price and units sold may be what? Backward bending. That if you price too high, you don't sell. You price too low, and people will infer a quality because of their data reduction methodologies. So there was an expression by P.T. Barnum, and some people attribute it to Abraham Lincoln. You can fool some of the people all the time, or all of the people some of the time. Well, that segment, that small percent of the people you can fool all of the time, that's called the idiot segment. And some marketeers will try to stretch that as far as they can using unethical marketing tactics to try to confuse consumers into believing they have high quality, because consumers will use signals maybe in an irrelevant way. Advertising messages is probably part of the problem. You will make claims on things that actually don't make sense. One of my favorite studies I've read was plants and colors can affect people's perception of your professionalism. What kind of plants should you have in the lobby of your company? Well, do not have cacti. No cactus, that's an incompetent plant. You want palm trees, beautiful green thick leaves. That's far better in your lobby compared to having a cactus. You are more professional. Banks, my favorite example, banks, that's totally commoditized. We're talking selling money. There's nothing you can do to differentiate. One of the issues, one of the dimensions at one point in history was trust. Are they reliable? Well, how do you make your bank more trustworthy and reliable? Well, a lot of British bankers came up with this idea of putting a facade, you know what that means, fake, a facade on the street, building it to look like a Parthenon, a temple. That must be secure. The Parthenon is still with us today. This must be a very reliable bank. And then you name your bank. You use the words like fidelity or trust, or name it after the largest city, etc. These are irrelevant signals of quality. And this is what marketers use in this perceptual space to compete. Now, we've covered the fact that we use these perceptual maps to help us with strategic planning exercises. What are the methodologies we use? I like to characterize the methodologies as being of one of two camps. The first camp is what I call the Anglo-Saxon approach. Why is that? Because most of the large mainstream consulting firms will sell this or use this technique in their engagements. Anglo-Saxon approach, largely factor analysis and principal components analysis. These techniques are extremely expensive because often it relies on pretty complicated questionnaire pre-testing, questionnaire implementation, cleaning of data, just very labor intensive. The algorithms to crank on the data are free, cheap, easy, and fast. No big deal in Python, R, or any number of statistical packages. I like to call the second school of thought the French school of thought. The French school of thought, I call it that way because when I was first being exposed to these tools, I noticed that a lot of the stars in this area were mathematicians from France who were actually doing improvements on these techniques. So in my mind, I've always thought them as French. And now the French school of thought, if you want to call it that, has constantly said that the Anglo-Saxon methods are totally flawed. They're wrong in terms of measuring human intelligence. They're simply wrong. The Anglo-Saxons, in the most part, haven't really heard of the French methods. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to expose both of them to you. You get to hear about both methodologies. You get to choose which one you think will be the most relevant for the study you're going to employ. Let's start with the Anglo-Saxon method. It typically starts with a focus group of consumers. Let's say we're doing a competitive analysis. You simply ask the consumers, off the top of their head, what makes one product different than another in a product category, whatever category you're interested in. Let's say I'm flying around Europe and there's a bunch of airlines, and I simply ask the airlines, so what makes one airline different from another airline? And they might say, well, let me think about that. There could be the price, the routes, the flight attendants, the service, the food, the music, the entertainment, the Wi-Fi, the comfort of the seat, the leg space, the overhead space. They're going to start listing things. It takes only about 5 minutes and you've already got 25 things. 25 things listed. Okay, perfect. Then what do? Step 2, you're going to ask people to evaluate each of the airlines on each of those dimensions. How good is Lufthansa on flight attendants? 1 is terrible, 5 is great. How good is Air France on food? 1 is terrible, 5 is great. And you simply go across all the airlines and have them fill out this questionnaire. This could be done online. Amazon launched something called mTurk, which is a nice way to collect data like this. So it's not difficult to collect the data. That's fairly easy. So we've got now, across 25 dimensions, a bunch of people telling us how different the different competitors are. Think of one question, 1 to 5. Where people say the product is where the ice cream stand is on that one beach for that one question. But what you'll realize is this. Many of those questions are redundant. When someone says quality of service and then they say attitudes of flight attendants, you might discover that those things are highly correlated with each other. In fact, consumers don't use 25 things when choosing across airlines. They use 2 or 3 broad dimensions to make that choice. What are those dimensions? So the next step is to do a factor or principal components analysis. My preference is to do both because you might find some differences. Statistically, in many cases, they're almost the same thing. So if you have a preconceived notion of what factors should arise, you probably use factor analysis. If not, principal components analysis will do just fine. Either one is good. What we're trying to do is look at the correlations across the questions, grouping questions together that are highly correlated, and then giving a name to those questions. Once we decide what those groups are of these questions, and there are statistical methods to help us determine that, we then put a label on those 2 dimensions. Those labels become the managerial tools we use to compete, sporty versus luxury. So what I'd like to do is show you a few historic cases, really the breakthrough ones, that in the field of strategy, marketing science, and management science, they literally open people's eyes up to this new approach. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the work and an example of John Hauser from MIT. Back in the early 80s, he was doing research on something called the narrowband video telephone. Very famous studies that he produced where he was trying to link basically customer research with R&D. How can we direct R&D in the right direction using customer research? And he's done amazing work in this area. You should really look him up. So let's go back in time and look at some of the early analysis for something called the video telephone, which was launched multiple times in multiple generations, going back even before the 1970s, multiple generations, each time failing. The earliest phones, the quality wasn't very good. Let's invest some money. They launch it again. Quality, not so good. So in one study, kind of like almost a post-mortem in my mind of those early generation of video telephones, what did we learn about consumer perceptions? Now, let's take a look in detail at John Hauser's analysis and factor analysis in this area. Okay, on this first diagram, what we have is what someone might call a snake plot. If you plot this in a circle, someone might call it a spider diagram. If you rotate it, 90 degrees this way, someone will call that a value curve. So these kinds of plots are called many different things in strategy. I like this representation. Here we've got 25 different things people were asked in his studies about this narrowband video telephone. It was competing a bunch against a number of other technologies like text messaging, dedicated video systems, etc. And you'll notice that some of these questions are highly correlated to each other. Just take a glance at question 16, 17, and 18, and you'll notice that people tended to answer those questions in roughly the same way. They follow generally the same pattern. Well, if that's true, then maybe those questions are redundant with each other. Whenever at INSEAD we do course evaluations, people will ask, how was the course? How was the professor? How were the materials? How much did you learn out of the course? Those questions are so correlated to each other, you might as well just ask people, was it a good course? Those are kind of almost the same dimension. They're highly correlated. All right, so we use factor analysis to do what? Now let me wave my hands. It correlates every question to every other question, looking for correlations across questions. Now, you can either let the statistics tell you the dimensions, or you can impose the dimensions you want to look at. Now, in Hauser's study, basically 2 dimensions were revealed in this study. Now, many of the questions loaded, these are called factor loadings, on the various questions. Dimension number 1, let's call that the black bar chart. In the black bar chart, all of the questions with a high value on that black bar chart tend to be redundant with each other. Forms of information exchange, for example, etc. All of those questions, solving problems, group discussions, all of that kind of the same thing. So what would we call that dimension? Just take a glance at some of the words there, and you have to think about it. Now, a trick we often use is sometimes we take the variable that has the highest loading on that dimension, or we find a variable that has a very good adjective. In this case, you'll see that John Hauser selected effectiveness, right? So there's effectiveness. Let's look at the second dimension. The second dimension is something about real hassle, saves time, planning in advance, etc. What is that all about? Now, you might think back about that. What's the opposite of real hassle? It means it's easy. Let's put ease of use. So now we realize that across these 25 questions in the snake plot, basically we can boil it down to 2 things: ease of use and effectiveness. And then we simply plot the competitors on those dimensions. And we get this map. So this is the resulting map. Again, this is unsupervised machine learning because effectiveness does not forecast ease of use, and ease of use does not predict effectiveness. It's just a plot, a description of the 2 dimensions used in the minds of the consumers at that point in time. So what do we notice? The most effective is personal visit. Very, very effective way of communicating with something. What's least effective? Maybe text messaging or something equivalent to that. What's the easiest to use? That would be a normal telephone, where you just pick up the phone and call someone. What's least easy to use is dedicated videos, right? Dedicated video service and or the video telephone itself. Now, what do you notice here is that personal visit is not only easier to use than the video telephone, but it's also vastly more effective. The video telephone is only marginally more effective than a regular telephone. In fact, probably statistically, they're equivalent. This is a fantastic news for AT&T because now they're not going to waste another $100 million on this crazy video phone idea. This product sucks. Now, if you see a result like this, it's incumbent on you to then dig into it a little bit and maybe follow up with the consumers and saying, what's going on with this product? So the video phone was largely a disaster. It was launched in multiple countries in Europe. In each case, this video phone was a disaster. Now, that's odd. Why? Because when you ask consumers, how many of you would like to see the person you're talking to, 70% of consumers said this is a great idea, I want to have that. Yet perceptually, you can see on the map that this product sucks. It's a horrible product. Why is that? What's so bad about it? Well, you do enough focus groups and external analysis to this map and you'll discover something. How many of you, just think about yourself, how many of us are ugly? Raise your hand if you're ugly. Yeah, ugly people. The video phone is a competitive disadvantage to you. Turns out the human face is often more ugly than the human voice. Human voices are beautiful. You can fall in love with someone's voice, then you see the hamster for the first time. Oh my God, let's keep this on a voice basis. So people are not good looking. Their voices are better looking. Therefore, video phones don't convey much of an advantage. Second, a lot of people want to have their privacy. How many of you would want your 6-year-old daughter to take a video phone call from someone that you do not know? Third, it was largely a business tool. It was supposed to compete against travel. And the problem is, across two people, if people don't use this product and you want someone to use the product, it's inferring you want to look at them. And that is actually socially incompatible. It's like opening someone's door and saying, let's have a chat. So you have to almost set up a meeting in order to use this product. Very difficult to use. How many of you have messy desks? Now you have to clean it up. How many of you like walking around while you're talking on the phone? You have to stand still now. There's so many things that go wrong with this product that you're thinking, oh yeah, it is kind of inconvenience. Now, many of you are thinking, well, wait a second. I've used products like this. This map is historic. It was a picture in time of humans' brains at a moment in history, right? Now, AT&T didn't sit still on this. Of course, they then innovated and out came video conferencing service. And you can see that it's positioned a little bit better than the video telephone. In fact, telephone and personal visit are not near each other on the map. Somebody at McKinsey or elsewhere would call them strategic complements. People will use both personal visit and telephone. Once we had video conferencing, that overcame some of the problems. No longer you had a chance to comb your hair and look good. You would read the documents ahead of time. You wouldn't be caught making stuff up. You wouldn't have to show off your office. Video conferencing was cool. Cisco Systems, 20 years later, launches something called telepresence. Unfortunately, it was not that much more effective, and the ease of use was not as good as they had hoped. So it really didn't fundamentally change the market too much. In fact, it was Skype. Skype, how many of you have ever done a Skype video? Well, who did you do it with first? Probably friends and family. They already know that you're kind of ugly, etc. They're willing to put up with the bad quality of service, so to speak. So if we ever want that super cool product that is both effective as a personal visit and as easy to use as a telephone, probably it's a Star Trek technology, beam me up Scotty approach. Okay, so that is the Anglo-Saxon method. Focus group, a lot of questionnaires, data reduction, map, strategic interpretation. Perfect. The French think it's totally wrong. Bad idea. Don't use this approach whatsoever. Why is that? Because there's a small intuition, and it may be true, that the methodology generates a psychological map in people's minds. It's not what they're really thinking, because people don't force themselves to think of dimensions before they compare products. They just do. So if you ever do an airline example, someone's going to mention the word safety. You put safety in a questionnaire, it will likely be orthogonal, totally different than all the other dimensions, and it'll be kind of important. How many of you have used safety as a criteria for travel, let's say between Paris and London, or between Paris and Frankfurt, etc.? It's not that common a dimension used by consumers. In fact, the most common is, where do you want to travel to? You've reduced the competitors to only a few. What time do you want to be there? Now you're down to less. Which one is on my frequent flyer program? You're on the less, etc. So many criteria we think might be used in travel actually are not used in travel. So the French approach, this multidimensional scaling approach, is saying if you let people say safety, it becomes a salient factor in the map, and actually that's not the way people think. So if I want to train a robot to be as intelligent as a human, to perceive the world like a human perceives it, and we want to train it using human data, this factor analysis approach may not be the right one. So there's an alternative, and that's called multidimensional scaling. Now, in certain areas, they're statistically identical, especially in the area of what we call metric multidimensional scaling, where we're using the same data as the factor analysis, and we're just calculating distances between the answers across the different competitors. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the non-metric approaches. Now, you all know what a map is, right? Our goal is to have a map at the end of the day. Really, that's what we want to have. You've actually gone to an atlas. And if I asked you, how far is Chicago to Atlanta in miles? How far are they? You ask a group of 30 people, and some people will say 2,000 miles. Some people will say 1,500 miles. Some people will say 500 miles. That's their perception. That's their perception. Well, there is a reality, right? In every map, you see the distances, right? There's a legend. And typically in the back of the maps, you'll see a distance matrix, a matrix of, distances from city A to city B. So the French method is very simple. We start with a map. That map leads to a distance matrix of sorts, right? Therefore, the distance matrix is in fact a map. It's simply in numerical format. That's all. It's just a different format. Well, if I can go from a map to a matrix, why not go from a matrix to a map? In other words, let's not ask people about the different dimensions where they think they might be thinking. That's the Anglo-Saxon approach. Rather, let's just get the map. Let's get the map directly. And then after the fact, debate what the dimensions are. So it actually reverses the order of how we go about business. Again, Anglo-Saxon, look at all the different dimensions, collapse them down to 2 or 3. French method, multidimensional scaling. Let's just get the frickin' map directly out of people's minds by having them tell us their matrix. And then we can debate what the maps are. Now, in the diagrams I'm showing you here, we've got maps of cities. The distance between Chicago and Atlanta, a little bit over 500 miles, almost 600 miles, right? If you took that and put it into a multidimensional scaling algorithm, it would produce a map of the United States. So in this map, Shepard shows us that people who live in Boston tend to see things near them as being fairly large. If you look at the Massachusetts, it takes about 3.5, 4 hours to drive from the New York border over to Boston. If you go to Nevada, it's kind of about 9, 10, 11 hours from the northern border to the southern border, depending on traffic, etc., from Vegas up to the Idaho border, and yet it's perceived to be small. What's far from us is small. Now, what do we infer from this? We infer a couple of things from this simple map that Shepard did. What do we infer? We infer that it's roughly correct. Roughly correct that you notice that there is a west coast, an east coast, north and south, right? Makes sense. But you also notice there can be magnitude errors on detail, magnitude errors of detail. People perceive these magnitude errors on detail, and once they understand what they are, it could be opportunistic for a marketeer or a firm to understand these things. For example, you'll find out that people, especially people who have low involvement in a category, when you ask them, they're going shopping really quick, they buy a shampoo, they walk away, they want to get out of the grocery store as quick as they possibly can, and you say, hold it, how much did you pay for that shampoo? And they're going to go, They're going to give you a number. Typically, the number they're going to give is lower than what they actually paid. They don't know how expensive this product is. They think they're getting a reasonable deal, but they're not. They're paying actually a high price. Okay, let's forget that story for a moment. That's very common in fast-moving consumer goods. Imagine a telephone call. I make a telephone call, and I'm dialing. And I'm calling maybe to my mother-in-law, 20-minute phone call. I make that call, and then I hang up. And then I'm asked the question, hey, how much did you pay for that phone call? Interesting. It turns out that people reverse it. They tend to actually say a number much, much higher than the actual number itself. i.e., they think the phone company is probably ripping them off for a long-distance phone call. So you end up getting these strange behaviors that this tool can map. The magnitude errors are worth arbitraging. So what I would like to do is describe a little bit about how we do this from a casual point of view. How does this French method work exactly? So let's use the example of an automobile. I'm going to be shopping for an automobile. Let's say we've got three: Mercedes, BMW, and Ford. A, B, and C, three different products there. And then you ask a consumer, how similar is Mercedes-Benz to Ford? One is close, very similar. It's like kilometers, right? They're very close. Versus 9, very different. Close, basically the same car. 9, that's like Ferrari to a Trabant or something like that. Just very, very different car. And people will typically say a number like 7. Okay, so how many maps can I draw with that one number? They perceive them to be different from each other. 7. Well, I can draw an infinite number of maps as long as the two dots are 7 apart. I could draw it this way, as long as it's 7 apart. I could put them over here. It doesn't matter. I just put 2 dots. That distance is 7. I say, okay, perfect. How different is Mercedes-Benz now to BMW? And they're going to think about it. They go, 2, maybe 3. Picking up 3. Okay, it's 3. Where can BMW go now? Well, for this consumer, it can go in a circle around Mercedes-Benz. It's still an infinite number of solutions, but it's kind of constrained a little bit, right? So we're rebuilding the map directly from the matrix. Then you say, well, okay, that's cool. How different is BMW to Ford in your mind? And they're going to be thinking about it, and they go, Ford, BMW. I'm going to say that's about an 8. Okay, if that's true, where can BMW now go on this map? A circle, 8 around only 2 locations. It can only go on 2 locations. So now we learn something. With only 3 questions, we've understood that this consumer believes that BM and Mercedes compete more with each other than either of them compete with Ford. So if Ford drops its price, frankly, Mercedes and BMW shouldn't care, because those consumers aren't going to be even comparing those products in reality. So I could keep asking more and more questions. You need about 6 to 8 competitive items in order to get the map to coalesce. And of course, this is extremely fast, inexpensive research. You simply ask people a matrix, you immediately get maps. Do all people have the same maps? No. So we might apply cluster analysis, and there's many methodologies to cluster perceptual data. Not a big deal. In fact, I would simply try multiple methodologies, whatever's at your disposal that you're familiar with. Throw the data in there and see what kind of results you get. And you might discover there might be 1, 2, or 3 segments in the market that view the world very differently. A very important thing to add to your map is something called the ideal point. What is the ideal point? You need to not think of it as a fantasy, something that I ideally would want to have if I was a rich person. No, it's something that you're likely to buy given your budget and given the competitors that are in front of you. So the ideal point, think of it as a 3-dimensional plot. Along the X and the Y, what you have is the attributes or the hoteling beaches that you're competing on. Your data reduction would have told you that. What's the 3rd dimension? The 3rd dimension is happiness or utility. The closer your brand is positioned towards that ideal point, the more people prefer your product. Now, in multidimensional scaling, we typically list the word ideal or your next purchase. How similar is Mercedes-Benz to your next purchase or to your ideal car? Some people will say 7. Some people will say 2. In other words, they might perceive all the cars to be relative to each other in a certain way, but ideal points are at different positions on that map depending on different customer preferences. So in the French method, we survey a bunch of people. In fact, it can be done very quickly. We kind of cluster the maps, and then we look at it and go, I wonder what the dimensions are. Over here, we've got a lot of European cars, and over here, we have a lot of North American brands. Maybe that horizontal dimension is Atlantic Ocean, East and West, right? European versus North American. Okay, great. And then you look at the second dimension, and you notice that you have up at the top, you have cars like Mercedes-Benz, you have even Ferrari, Lamborghini, you have brands like, and down at the bottom you have Renault, Peugeot, and the bottom you have Ford, you have other brands at the bottom. Oh, maybe that's the perceived value, lower price, higher price, North American value, quality, etc., boiling it down to very simple dimensions. So let's summarize. What is this all about? We're trying to understand human intelligence and creating a model we can use trained by human data. Once we've got the data on our computer, we can simulate consumer choices. If we offered them this product, they're most likely to buy this product. On what basis should we differentiate? Oh, our model tells us consumers use this psychological dimension. So we use data reduction tools and strategy very often to boil down the data in the minds of consumers to understand their perceptual maps. Now, in physics, chemistry, and other disciplines, we use factor analysis and cluster analysis for many other things as well. From a strategy point of view, the most common elements are typically consumer research. Note that these data are typically not in your data warehouse. It'll require you to leave your data warehouse, which is mostly about your own company and your own customers, and find out how people perceive competitive products or competitive clusters. In the next videos, we're going to talk about the simple methodology. How do we implement this in a focus group? Really quick and dirty, using even an online widget, for example, to do perceptual mapping. See you soon. Bye-bye.